On the night of the 28th of January, 1999, the woman Britain had sworn would never be queen walked deliberately into a wall of camera flashes outside the Ritz Hotel in London, and that single-staged photograph was the opening move in a secret palace campaign to make the nation accept her. If this account has been useful, subscribing costs nothing, and more stories like this one are queued. The bell notification means you will see them. Start with the photograph, because everything else grows out of it. The party inside the Ritz that night had been a 50th birthday for Camilla's sister, an ordinary family occasion. And when it ended, Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles did something they had never once done in all the years the country had been whispering about them. They left together, through the front doors, straight into the light. For years, the two of them had been kept carefully apart in public, moved through side entrances, driven in separate cars, photographed only by accident and never on purpose. Now here they were, standing shoulder to shoulder on the pavement, letting the cameras have them at last. And nothing about it was an accident. Not the timing, not the venue, not the slow, unhurried walk to the waiting car while the flash guns went off like a small electrical storm. The whole scene had been arranged by a man named Mark Bolland. The press secretary Charles had quietly hired, and inside palace circles the plan to repair Camilla's image already had a name. They called it Operation PB. Those two letters stood for Parker Bowles, and that code name tells you almost everything about how the monarchy understood the situation. This was not treated as a love story to be announced to a delighted public. It was treated as a reputation to be rebuilt from the ground up, planned and staged with the cold discipline of a military campaign. Hanging over that one image outside the Ritz was a single question. It is the question this whole story exists to answer. How do you take a woman an entire nation has sworn will never be queen? A woman half the country openly despises and slowly, quietly turn her into someone that same country will accept? Not with a grand speech, not overnight, but by inches over years until one morning the public looks up and discovers it has changed its mind without ever being able to remember the moment it happened. To understand how enormous that task really was, you have to remember what Camilla actually was in 1999. She was the villain, not a villain among several, the villain of the whole royal story. She was the name pinned to the collapse of the marriage of Charles and Diana, the other woman, the third figure standing in the shadows of the most watched fairy tale of the century. Ordinary people who had never met her spoke about her with a personal burning contempt, as if she had wronged them directly. The public had made up its mind, and the verdict was merciless. Hold on to how completely this country hated her in 1999. You will need that feeling at the very end. The hatred had a source, and it had a date. In November of 1995, Diana sat in a dimly lit room at Kensington Palace and gave an interview to the BBC programme Panorama. Around 23 million people watched it in Britain alone, which in a country that size is not an audience. It is practically the entire adult nation gathered in front of the same screen on the same night. And in that room, in a low and careful voice, Diana said one sentence that would follow Camilla for the rest of her life. Asked about her marriage, she said there were 3 people in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. She never spoke the name. She did not have to. Every single one of those 23 million viewers knew exactly who the third person was. And from that night on, Camilla was fixed forever in the public imagination as the woman in the room who had no right to be there. Then came 1997. When Diana died in 1997, in that underpass in Paris, the anger did not soften. It set hard like concrete. Whatever sympathy the country might one day have found for Camilla was buried under a tide of grief for the woman she had been cast against, a grief so vast it stopped the traffic and covered the palace gates in flowers. Friends of Camilla later said she barely left her house in the weeks that followed, that she stayed behind closed curtains while the nation wept for someone else. Staff recalled the security around her being quietly tightened after she was heckled in the street, jeered at in broad daylight by ordinary passers-by who felt they had every right to do it. Sit with that picture for a moment. Here was a woman who needed a protection detail, not because of terrorists, not because of stalkers, but because the British public could not bear the sight of her face. That is the measure of where this story begins. So think about the problem that landed on the palace desk. Ask yourself how you would defend the most hated woman in Britain to a nation still grieving Diana. Go on. Genuinely try it. What do you say? You cannot go on television and plead her case, because every kind word spoken in her favour lands as an insult to the dead princess the country adored. You cannot simply buy friendly newspapers. You cannot stage a great public apology either, because an apology admits the very guilt you are trying to make people forget. The palace understood all of this with perfect clarity. It knew it could not argue with the nation directly. You do not win that argument. You cannot stand up and defend the villain to a country in mourning and expect anything but fury. So the palace decided you simply could not, and instead it did something else entirely. This is the moment Mark Bolland becomes the most important man in the story. Bolland's whole insight was that the answer was not a defence at all. It was patience, disguised as strategy. If you cannot win the argument in one move, then you do not make one move. You make 1,000 tiny ones, each so small that no single one of them is worth the trouble of objecting to. A charity gala here. A photograph taken at a careful, respectful distance there. Camilla glimpsed leaving a building, never explained, never justified, simply present in the frame. Each image was released into the world and then left completely alone to settle, the way sediment sinks slowly to the bottom of a still glass of water before the next one was ever risked. Biographers who later studied the campaign described it as something measured in years, not in months, one carefully chosen photograph at a time. That phrase is the entire method, so let it stand. There was no grand gesture, because a grand gesture would have been shot down the instant it appeared. Instead, there was attrition, quiet and relentless. Every single appearance was a test. How much would the public tolerate today? A fraction more than yesterday? Then tomorrow you nudge it a fraction further still. If a photograph drew too much heat, Bolland pulled back and waited, sometimes for weeks, letting the temperature drop before he tried again. If an image passed by quietly, with no outrage, then he had won an inch of ground. He would never surrender. He was not trying to change the mind of the country in a day. He was trying to move it so gradually that it would never once feel itself moving. And that is precisely what made the night at the Ritz so deliberate. It was not two people in love finally letting their guard down. It was the first controlled release in a very long campaign. The calculated moment the palace judged that the public was ready to see the two of them standing together on a pavement and not erupt. It worked. Barely, quietly, with no applause and no riot. And because it worked, the next step could be planned. The machine had taken its first breath. But here is where the whole strategy slammed into a wall. Because before Bolland could risk the public at all, before a single charity gala or a single careful photograph, he faced one test far larger than the entire hostile press of Fleet Street put together. Every newspaper in Britain could, in the end, be managed with enough time and enough patience. But there was one person whose approval mattered more than all of those front pages combined, one door that no press secretary on earth had the power to force open. And until that one door opened, the whole campaign was frozen exactly where it stood, unable to take a step in any direction. That person was the Queen, Elizabeth II herself, the monarch, Diana's former mother-in-law, the woman who had watched, in silence, as Camilla became the name attached to the wreckage of her own son's marriage. Before the country could ever be asked to soften toward Camilla, before any of Boland's careful images could mean anything, the Queen first had to be persuaded to do the one thing she had refused to do for years. She had to be willing to stand in the same room as the woman blamed for it all, and nobody, not Boland, not Charles, not a single soul inside those palace walls, had any idea whether she ever would. And then, without warning and without ceremony, the door opened. In June of 2000, at a party for the exiled King of Greece, Elizabeth II allowed herself to stand in the same room as Camilla Parker Bowles. It was the first time. There was no handshake announced to the press, no photograph released to prove goodwill, no line of statement from the palace saying the two had met at last. There was only the fact of it. Two women under one roof. One of them the Queen of England, the other the woman a nation still blamed for the ruin of her heir's marriage. And that was the entire point, not the words, the proximity. The aides who arranged that evening did not treat it as a social occasion. They treated it as a diplomatic one, the way you would treat a first meeting between two governments that had spent years refusing to recognize each other. Every detail was considered. Who would arrive when? Who would stand where? How long the monarch would remain in the room? And how casually the encounter could be made to look, so that later, when word of it slipped out, it would seem like nothing at all. That was the craft of it, to make the most carefully managed moment of the whole campaign appear completely ordinary. Because here is how royal approval actually moves. It does not travel through a press release. It does not travel through a statement of support read aloud by a spokesman. In the House of Windsor, approval travels through presence, through the simple photographable fact of two people willing to be seen breathing the same air. If the Queen was prepared to be in a room with you, then the argument about whether you were acceptable was, in a quiet and unofficial way, already half over. Mark Boland understood that better than anyone. He knew that a single image of Elizabeth II and Camilla under the same roof would do work that 10,000 friendly headlines never could. It said, without saying anything, that the head of the family had stopped treating this woman as the enemy, and watch what they never did. Across the entire campaign, from that first careful room to the years that followed, they never once let her explain herself. Camilla did not sit down for the confessional interview. She did not answer Diana's charges. She did not tell her side of the story on television to 23 million people the way Diana had. She said, in public, almost nothing at all. That silence was not an accident, and it was not shyness. It was policy. Because the moment Camilla opened her mouth to defend herself, she would have reminded the country of exactly what it was being asked to forgive. So they kept her quiet, and they let the pictures do the talking instead. The biographers who studied it later saw the shape of it clearly. Penny Junor, who wrote about Charles and Camilla in more detail than almost anyone, described a campaign measured in years, not months, not a single grand gesture that turned opinion overnight, but a long, patient sequence of small advances, each one a deliberate test. How much would the public tolerate this week? A little more than last week, then risk a little more the week after. Every appearance was a probe sent out to measure the temperature of the nation, and if the temperature held, the next probe went a step further. If the country recoiled, they simply waited and let the recoil fade and tried again more gently. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was forced. The whole thing advanced at the speed of the public's own slow forgetting, and the steps themselves were tiny. A charity gala here, where Camilla arrived formally dressed and said her few words to no one in particular, and left. A photograph at a distance there, a long lens catching her at some event, present but not central, visible but not demanding, always advancing, never retreating, and never, at any point, letting her stand up and plead her own case. The campaign moved forward one carefully chosen photograph at a time, and each photograph was chosen for exactly what it showed, and exactly what it left out. What it left out mostly was glamour. This is the part that people miss. Camilla could have fought Diana's memory on Diana's own ground. She could have chased the beautiful frocks, the magazine covers, the dazzling public image that had made the Princess of Wales the most photographed woman on earth. She did the opposite. She built her public identity around osteoporosis charities and adult literacy, bone disease and reading, work that photographed as service rather than spectacle, work no one could resent, because there is nothing to resent about a woman helping people learn to read. Staff who watched her in those years described someone who understood something almost no other royal has ever admitted out loud. That for her, in her particular situation, being dull in public was a strategy, not a weakness, a weapon. Diana had won the nation's love by being electric, luminous, impossible to look away from. Camilla would win its tolerance by being the exact opposite, unremarkable, reliable, a little ordinary, the kind of woman who turns up, does the visit, thanks the nurses and goes home. You cannot build a scandal out of a woman like that. You cannot sell newspapers with her. And slowly, page by page, the press that had made a fortune casting her as the villain began to run out of things to say. That was Operation PB, doing precisely what it had been built to do. The code name that had hung over the staged photograph outside the Ritz was no longer just an opening move. By now it was an operation delivering results, quietly, month after month, exactly as designed. Each cautious appearance banked, each hostile front page a little less hostile than the one before. The bread rolls that had once been thrown were not yet applause, but they were no longer being thrown. And then, on the 9th of April, 2005, the campaign reached the altar. Charles married Camilla in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, not a grand cathedral wedding with the world watching every step. A civil ceremony, in a register office in the town of Windsor, the same kind of wedding any ordinary couple might have. The Queen did not attend the ceremony itself, though she came to the blessing that followed and gave her public support. It was modest by royal standards, and the modesty was the message. This was not a coronation of a new fairy tale princess. This was two older people, long attached, finally making their union legitimate and public and legal after decades of it being neither. But the real decision, the one that reveals the whole strategy in a single stroke, was not about the ceremony. It was about what to call her afterwards. Because when a man who will one day be king marries, his wife takes a title. The obvious title, the one that had belonged to the wife of the Prince of Wales for centuries, was Princess of Wales. It was hers by right of the marriage. By every rule of protocol, Camilla was now the Princess of Wales. They did not use it. Notice the word they refused to use. Not because it was not hers to take, it was, but because it still belonged, in the public mind, to a dead woman. Princess of Wales was Diana's title. It was stitched into the country's grief, spoken over her coffin, carved into the memory of that week in 1997, when the flowers piled up outside the palace gates. To place that title on Camilla, the woman blamed for Diana's unhappiness, would have been to hand the tabloids the single most explosive headline of the entire campaign. Years of patient work undone in one word. So they reached for another title instead. Camilla was styled Duchess of Cornwall, a real title, a legitimate one drawn from Charles's other holdings, and one that carried no ghost with it, no comparison, no wound reopened. The newspapers announced it the next morning, Duchess of Cornwall, and the country on the whole accepted it without a fight, which was exactly the outcome the choice had been engineered to produce. Think about the discipline in that. At the very moment of victory, at the wedding they had spent 6 years making possible, the palace still would not reach for the title that was legally hers. They ceded Diana's ground on purpose. They gave up the grander name to keep the peace because they understood, better than the public ever did, that the campaign was not won yet, and that one careless collision with Diana's memory could still sink the whole thing. It was the same instinct that had staged the photograph outside the Ritz, the same instinct that had kept Camilla silent for 6 years. Advance where it is safe. Never, ever advance where the ghost of Diana is standing. And it worked. The wedding came and went. The Duchess of Cornwall did her charity visits and read to school children and said very little, and the outrage that everyone had braced for simply did not arrive. The most hated woman in Britain was now, legally and publicly, married to the future king, and the nation had let it happen almost without noticing. One carefully chosen photograph at a time had carried her all the way to the register office at Windsor Guildhall, and the country had barely raised its voice. But look closely at what that wedding actually proved. It proved something narrower than it seemed. It proved that the palace would step with enormous care around any title that still belonged to Diana. It proved they could avoid a word. That is not the same as proving they could claim one, because there was a word the ceremony left completely untouched. Not Princess of Wales. They had a substitute ready for that. This other word had no substitute. There was no polite alternative to reach for, no Duchess of somewhere to hide behind. It was the word the whole marriage pointed toward, and the whole marriage refused to say. Inside the palace, staff later suggested it was handled like something radioactive, spoken of carefully, if it was spoken of at all, because it named the exact promise the country had sworn would never be kept. That word was Queen. When Charles became king, the rules of the monarchy said his wife would ordinarily become queen alongside him, Queen Camilla. And to a nation that had spent the 1990s absolutely certain that this woman would never, under any circumstances, wear a crown, those two words together sounded less like a title and more like a provocation. The palace knew it. That is why the wedding said everything except that. They had rehabilitated her image. They had married her to the heir. They had walked her past Diana's memory without a single headline detonating. But the crown itself, the actual lowering of a crown onto Camilla's head in front of the country and the cameras, was a risk that lived in a category entirely its own. If a channel this careful with the record has earned a minute of your trust, subscribing costs nothing, and there are more of these palace stories already waiting behind the notification bell. Now, back to the one word the palace could not yet say, because the truth was that in 2005, no one inside the operation believed the public would allow it. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. You could soften a woman. You could marry her into the family. You could teach a hostile press to run out of ammunition. But could you actually crown her? Could you take the same nation that had jeered her in the street and put Queen in front of her name and expect it to stand and watch without objection? That was the question the wedding did not answer. That was the question it deliberately postponed. And it is the question that everything, all of it, the photograph outside the Ritz, the careful room with the King of Greece, the 6 silent years, the charity galas, the borrowed title, had been quietly building toward all along. The campaign had reached the altar. It had not yet reached the crown, and whether the crown could ever really be lowered onto Camilla's head was, in that spring of 2005, a gamble almost no one at the palace was yet willing to make. Queen. That was the word the wedding could not say, the one the palace treated as radioactive, and to earn it, Camilla did the least glamorous thing imaginable. She spent the years after 2005 becoming on purpose the most unremarkable royal in Britain. Think about how strange that is. Most people in her position would have reached for the cameras, for the gowns, for the grand entrances that make a princess feel like a princess. Camilla did the opposite. She went small. She went quiet. And she did it on advice deliberately, because someone around her had understood a very simple thing about the country she needed to win over. So she picked her ground with care. Not the glittering charities, not the fashion, not the causes that fill a front page with colour. She built a public identity around osteoporosis, the bone disease that had killed her own mother and grandmother, and around literacy, the plain business of getting children to read. 2 causes that no one could resent. 2 causes that photographed as work rather than glamour. And that word, work, is the key to the whole thing. Picture the images that came out of those years. Camilla in a bare hospital corridor, listening to a woman describe the pain of a spine that had begun to crumble. Camilla in a school hall, sitting on a low chair among children and paperback books, being handed a story by a 6-year-old. There is nothing in those pictures to envy, nothing to set beside the memory of Diana in an evening dress, nothing, in short, to hate. That was the point. Staff who worked around her in those years described a woman who understood exactly what she was doing, and the reading they gave of it is almost cold in its clarity. Being dull in public for Camilla was not a failure of personality. It was the strategy. She gave the press no scandal to chase and no glamour to resent. And she did it day after grey day, opening a clinic here, praising a reading scheme there, until the very ordinariness of her became a kind of armour. Because here is the problem the hostile papers now faced, and it is worth sitting with. For years they had run on fuel. There was the affair, the phone call, the third person in the marriage, the villain of the great royal tragedy. Every one of those was a story you could fire again and again. But a woman who does nothing but visit hospitals and hand out books gives you nothing to load. The scandal was old, the anger was spent, and the new material, the material she was making every week, was so relentlessly plain that no editor could shape it into an attack. Slowly, and this is the part almost no one clocked at the time, the press ran out of ammunition, not because they had forgiven her, because there was simply nothing left to shoot. You cannot keep a villain alive on a diet of osteoporosis leaflets and school reading corners. The story needs oxygen, and she had quietly cut off the supply. And as the fire went out, something shifted in the crowds. Remember what those crowds had been. In the years after Diana's death, Camilla had been heckled in the street. Friends said she barely left her own house. At one public appearance, in the fury of that time, someone in the crowd threw bread rolls at her. That is not a metaphor. Actual bread rolls, thrown at a real woman by people who wanted her to know exactly how the country felt. Now track the same crowds forward. Year by year, the jeering thinned. The hostile placards stopped appearing. The bread rolls once thrown in her direction became, at engagement after engagement, polite applause. It is a small, almost comic detail, and yet it is the truest measure we have of what happened. A nation does not announce that it has changed its mind, it just claps a little awkwardly at a woman it used to boo, and moves on with its day. The applause was the verdict, delivered without anyone ever calling a vote. Step back and look at what had actually been built. Not affection, exactly. Not the wild love the public had poured onto Diana. Something quieter and, for the palace, far more useful. Tolerance, familiarity. The dull, settled feeling that this woman had simply always been there, doing her rounds, and was not worth the energy of hatred anymore. That feeling is not an accident. It is manufactured, slowly, out of 1,000 unremarkable afternoons. And it was manufactured on purpose. Which brings us to the thing the wedding had refused to name. The word left in the box marked radioactive. For 18 years after the marriage, no one in an official position dared say it out loud about her, because to say it was to test the one question that had hung over everything since that first night outside the Ritz. Would Britain actually stand for it? Would the country that threw bread rolls allow a crown to come down on that particular head? And then the palace decided it was ready to find out. Before we walk into that room, one thing worth saying plainly. If a channel this careful with the difference between the story you were told and the story that actually happened has earned a minute of your trust, then subscribing costs nothing, and there are more of these palace stories already waiting behind the notification bell. Turn it on, and you will see them. Now back to the Abbey, because this is the moment the whole long campaign had been walking toward. Remember the crowd that once threw bread rolls at her. Now watch the same nation stand in silence as the crown comes down. The 6th of May, 2023, Westminster Abbey, the same building where kings and queens of England have been crowned for the better part of 1,000 years, filled with heads of state, with cameras, with the full weight of the institution. And into the centre of it walked the woman who, 24 years earlier, could barely leave her own front door. Watch what happened, because it happened almost gently. There was no long debate about her right to be there, no wall of protest outside, no headline screaming that the villain had won. The service moved through its ancient stages, and then, at the appointed moment, Queen Mary's crown was lifted and lowered, slowly, onto the head of Queen Camilla. Say those two words again and feel how impossible they should have been. Queen Camilla. The title the wedding could not whisper, placed on her in front of the world, sealed in golden history. And the nation that had once jeered her, the nation of the bread rolls and the heckling and the tightened security, did the strangest thing of all. It said nothing. Almost no one objected. There were no riots, no mass complaint, no great public revolt. A few grumbled columns, easily ignored. Millions watched it on television as though it were the most natural thing in the world. A woman being crowned queen beside her husband the king, and turned off their sets and put the kettle on. The most hated woman in Britain had become its queen, and the country received the news with a shrug. That shrug is the entire story. That shrug is the victory. Because now, standing at the end of it, you can see the shape of the thing whole. This is where interpretation is allowed, because now the evidence is all in front of you. Camilla was not accepted by luck. She was not saved by the mere passing of time, the lazy idea that people forget if you wait long enough. People do not forget a woman they threw bread at. They have to be led, carefully, away from that memory. And led is exactly the word. She was made queen the same way that first photograph outside the Ritz was taken. Deliberately, under management. One carefully chosen photograph at a time, the charity visit that photographed as service, the dull, safe cause chosen because it could not be resented. The years of visible, boring work that starved the press of anything to attack, the slow substitution of applause for anger. Every single step was a picture, and every picture was chosen, and the pictures together did what no argument ever could have. They did not tell the country to accept her. They simply showed her again and again until acceptance felt like something the country had decided all on its own. That was always the genius of it, and the quiet ruthlessness. Operation PB, the code name that Press Secretary Mark Boland's campaign carried inside palace circles from that very first night at the Ritz, was never a debate the palace tried to win in public. You cannot argue a nation out of hating someone. Argue, and you remind everyone why they hated her. So they never argued. They arranged. They chose the images, released them at the right pace, tested each one, and let the country draw its own slow conclusion from a story that had been quietly built for it to find. And it worked so completely that here is the last unsettling truth of the whole affair. The strangest part is not that they won. The strangest part is how few people ever noticed the argument was being fought at all, or realized, when it ended, that it had already been won. Think back to 1999, and the woman who could barely leave her own house, guarded, heckled, certain she would never be more than the villain of someone else's marriage. Then look at the crown coming down in the Abbey. The distance between those two images is enormous, a whole life turned inside out, and that distance is the whole trick. You were meant never to see it being walked. You were meant to look up one day at a coronation and feel that of course she was queen, that it had somehow always been heading here, that nothing in particular had been done to make it so. Something very much had been done. It began on the night of the 28th of January, 1999, when two figures stepped out of the Ritz Hotel and walked, on purpose, straight into a wall of camera flashes. That was not a couple caught by chance. That was the opening move of a campaign that would run for a quarter of a century, and every flashbulb that fired that night was the first of the carefully chosen photographs that would end, one image at a time, with a crown. The question hanging over that photograph has its answer now. Could Britain be made to accept, as Queen, the woman it had sworn would never wear the title? Yes, quietly, patiently, one carefully chosen photograph at a time, and the argument was won before most people ever knew it was being fought. Hold the two pictures together. One last time, the flashbulbs outside the Ritz, the crown coming down in the Abbey, everything that decided who the nation would forgive and who it never would, happened in the space between them, in rooms you were never shown, made by people who understood that the loudest way to change a mind is the one thing that never works, and that the quietest campaign, the one no one ever sees, is the one that wins.